Outside Small's Paradise on 7th Avenue, the most dangerous man in Harlem dropped to his knees and wept like a child. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man who controlled the numbers, who walked with gangsters and politicians alike, who'd survived Alcatraz and countless attempts on his life, clutched a crumpled newspaper in his trembling hands. His expensive suit collected dirt from the sidewalk. Passers-by froze. Some stared. Others looked away, unsure what to do when a legend breaks in public. The headline blurred through his tears. Mother and child found dead in Harlem apartment. He was certain it was his daughter. His granddaughter. Gone. For 3 hours. Bumpy Johnson believed he'd failed the only people who truly mattered. 3 hours of hell. 3 hours of praying to a God he wasn't sure listened to men like him. But here's the thing about that morning: it wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the consequence. To understand how the most feared man in Harlem ended up broken on a sidewalk, begging for mercy he didn't deserve, we need to rewind exactly 24 hours. Harlem in the summer of 1952 wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a world unto itself. The kind of place where jazz spilled out of basement clubs at 3 a.m, where the smell of fried chicken and collard greens mixed with car exhaust and cigarette smoke, where everyone knew everyone else's business before the sun came up. It was beautiful and brutal at the same time. Elegant brownstones stood next to crumbling tenements. Cadillacs rolled past children playing in water from busted fire hydrants. June in Harlem meant heat that didn't quit, the kind that made shirts stick to backs and tempers run short. But it also meant life vendors hawking everything from sweet potato pies to stolen watches, women in their finest dresses heading to church or work, men gathered on corners debating politics, sports, and survival. And in the middle of it all stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. If you lived in Harlem in 1952, you knew the name, you knew the reputation. Bumpy ran the numbers racket, the underground lottery that kept money flowing through black hands when white banks wouldn't give loans and white businesses wouldn't hire. He wasn't just a gangster, he was an institution, a necessary evil, a Robin Hood in a tailored suit. The police knew him, the Italian mob knew him, City Hall knew him, and the people of Harlem, they respected him in ways that confused outsiders. Because Bumpy Johnson did something most criminals didn't, he gave back. He paid rent for families about to be evicted. He funded scholarships for kids who'd never see college otherwise. He made sure local businesses stayed protected. When someone in Harlem had a problem the law wouldn't solve, they came to Bumpy. And more often than not, he solved it. But power comes with a price. By June of 1952, Bumpy Johnson was 47 years old and carrying weight that had nothing to do with his empire. His daughter, Elise, had fallen deep into heroin addiction, a plague that was tearing through Harlem like wildfire, destroying families and futures. She'd cut him off years earlier, refusing his help, refusing contact. 3 weeks before our story begins, Elise gave birth to a baby girl, Margaret, Bumpy's granddaughter. He'd only heard about it through the streets, whispers, rumors. He didn't know where they were living, didn't know if the baby was healthy, didn't know if Elise was using around the child. The not knowing was killing him. So on Thursday, June 12th, 1952, Bumpy Johnson sat in the back of his black Cadillac, returning from a routine meeting with policy operators, trying to focus on business while his mind stayed stuck on a granddaughter he'd never held. He had no idea his entire world was about to shift. Before we move on, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. 2:34 p.m. The black Cadillac rolled to a stop at the red light on Lenox Avenue, right near 132nd Street. William, quick. Davis sat behind the wheel, one hand draped casually over the steering wheel, the other resting on the door. He'd been driving for Bumpy Johnson for 6 years. He knew the routes, knew the rhythms, knew when to talk and when to stay quiet. Today was a quiet day. The street buzzed with typical Thursday afternoon energy. A fruit vendor called out prices on the corner. 2 old men argued over a domino game outside a barber shop. A group of teenagers laughed too loud about something that probably wasn't that funny. Normal, routine, safe. Then came the tap on the window. Soft at first, almost hesitant. Quick glance to his right and saw a small hand pressed against the glass. His jaw tightened. Street kids begging at car windows wasn't unusual, but it was always a problem. Stop for one, and 5 more would appear. Draw attention, and cops might roll by asking questions nobody wanted to answer. He raised his hand to wave the kid away. Roll the window down. Bumpy's voice came from the back seat. Calm, quiet, but absolute. Quick hesitated for half a second, then obeyed. The glass lowered with a smooth mechanical hum. The girl standing there couldn't have been older than 6, maybe 5. Her dress, if you could call it that, was faded pink, 2 sizes too small, with stains that told stories no child should live. Her arms were stick-thin, her knees were ashy, her hair was pulled back in uneven braids that looked like someone had tried their best with nothing to work with. But it was her face that hit the hardest. Hollow, tired, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't belong on a child. The look of someone who'd learned too early that the world doesn't care if you're hungry. She looked up at Bumpy with wide, uncertain eyes. "Are you Bumpy?" she asked. Her voice was barely louder than the street noise around them. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, his expression softening in a way Quick had rarely seen. "Yes, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm Bumpy." Relief washed over her face like she'd just found the answer to a prayer. "My mama says you're the good guy in town," she said, her words tumbling out faster now. "She says you help people who need help. She says if anyone can fix things, it's you." Quick felt something tighten in his chest. He'd heard people call Bumpy a lot of things over the years: boss, kingpin, enforcer, legend. But the good guy? From the mouth of a starving child? That hit different. Bumpy didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, really looked, like he was seeing something beyond the moment, beyond the street, beyond the girl herself. "What's your name, baby?" he finally asked. "Keisha," she said. "Keisha Williams?" "Well, Keisha Williams. What can I do for you today?" She swallowed hard. Her small hands twisted the fabric of her dress. "My mama and me. We're hungry all the time," she said, her voice cracking just a little. "We don't got enough food. Mommy says we might lose our home. The landlord keeps yelling at her. She cries at night when she thinks I'm asleep. But I hear her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Can you help us, please?" The street noise seemed to fade. The domino game, the fruit vendor, the teenagers. All of it became background static. Quick glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw something he'd never seen before. Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd stared down mobsters, who'd survived Alcatraz, who'd built an empire with his bare hands, had tears running down his face. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent, steady tears. Quick looked away. It felt wrong to witness it, too private, too raw. But Bumpy didn't wipe his eyes. He just reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick fold of cash. He peeled off several $20 bills, more money than most Harlem families saw in a month, and handed them through the window. "You give this to your mama?" Bumpy said, his voice steady despite the tears. "You tell her Bumpy Johnson is going to help. My men will come by tomorrow. You'll have food. You'll keep your home. You hear me?" Kesha's eyes went wide. She clutched the bills like they were made of gold. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." The light turned green. Quick eased the Cadillac forward, and Kesha stepped back onto the sidewalk, still staring at the money in her hands like she couldn't believe it was real. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Bumpy's voice came from the back seat, low and firm. "Find her apartment, pay 2 years' rent up front, set up weekly food deliveries, get her mother a job, something stable, and I want someone checking on that child regularly. Not next week, today." Quick nodded. "Yes, sir." But what he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that he'd just watched his boss break. And he had no idea why. If this story is hitting you, tap that like button. It helps more people discover these untold stories. And trust me, you need to hear how this ends. The Cadillac moved through Harlem's streets in silence. Quick kept his eyes on the road, but his mind stayed on what he'd just witnessed. In 6 years of working for Bumpy Johnson, he'd seen the man handle every kind of situation. Threats, betrayals, violence, police raids, sit-downs with the Italian families who wanted a piece of Harlem's action. Never once had he seen Bumpy cry. Not when his best friend got gunned down outside the Cotton Club. Not when the feds dragged him back to court for the 3rd time. Not even when his own daughter told him she never wanted to see him again. But a hungry little girl at a red light had broken him in under 2 minutes. Quick, wanted to ask why, wanted to understand, but he knew better. Some things you don't question. Some pain is too personal to put into words. What Quick didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that when Bumpy looked at Keisha Williams, he didn't just see a starving child. He saw his granddaughter. 3 weeks earlier, Word had reached Bumpy through the streets that Elise had given birth. A baby girl, Margaret, his first grandchild. The news should have brought joy, should have been a reason to celebrate. Instead, it brought terror, because Elise was deep in the grip of heroin. So deep that she'd disappeared into the darkest corners of Harlem, the places where addicts went to vanish. Bumpy had tried to find her, sent his best men to search, offered money, help, treatment, anything. She didn't want to be found. And now there was a baby, his granddaughter, living God knows where, surrounded by God knows who. Maybe fed, maybe not, maybe safe, maybe dying slowly in some rat-infested apartment while her mother chased the next high. The not knowing was torture. Every night, Bumpy lay awake imagining the worst. Margaret crying in a dirty crib with no one coming. Margaret, hungry, cold, neglected. Margaret growing up the way Kesha Williams was growing up, thin, hollow-eyed, begging strangers for help because the people who were supposed to protect her couldn't, or wouldn't. When Kesha tapped on that window, Bumpy didn't just see her face. He saw Margaret's future, and it destroyed him. That's why the tears came. That's why he handed over enough cash to change a family's life without hesitation. That's why he gave quick those orders with such urgency. Because if he couldn't save his own granddaughter, maybe, just maybe, he could save someone else's. That evening, Bumpy sat in his living room with his wife, May. She'd been with him through everything: the prison sentences, the wars with rival gangs, the constant threat of violence. She knew him better than anyone alive, and she knew something was wrong. "You've been quiet all night," she said, sitting beside him on the couch. "What happened today?" Bumpy stared at his hands for a long moment. Then he told her everything. About Kesha Williams at the red light. About the tears he couldn't control. About the fear that had been eating him alive for 3 weeks. About Margaret, somewhere out there in Harlem, possibly suffering, while he sat powerless in his own home. "I built an empire," he said quietly. "I control half this neighborhood. I've got politicians in my pocket and cops on my payroll, but I can't protect my own blood. What kind of man does that make me?" Mamie took his hand. "It makes you human," she said, "and it makes you a man who's trying. That's more than most can say." Bumpy nodded, but the weight didn't lift. He went to bed that night with Kesha's face in his mind, and Margaret's imagined face right beside it. He didn't sleep, and when morning came, everything got worse. What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing when you all tune in. Friday morning arrived with the same oppressive heat as the day before. Bumpy Johnson woke up exhausted. Not from lack of sleep, though. He'd barely gotten 3 hours, but from the weight pressing down on his chest. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying fear you can't shake and guilt you can't fix. Mamie was already up, moving quietly through the house. She didn't ask how he slept. She already knew. By 9:30 a.m., Bumpy was dressed and heading out. He needed to move, needed to think, needed to be around people so the silence in his head would stop screaming. He told Quick to take him to Small's Paradise. Small's was more than just a restaurant and nightclub. It was a Harlem institution. During the day, it served as an unofficial meeting place for the neighborhood's power players, politicians, businessmen, entertainers, and men like Bumpy, who operated in the spaces the law pretended not to see. The staff knew him, had a table ready before he walked through the door: coffee, eggs, toast, the usual. Bumpy sat down, nodded his thanks, and tried to focus on the morning paper someone had left on the table. The New York Times, June 13th, 1952. He flipped through the pages without really reading. National news, sports, editorials. His mind was elsewhere, on Kesha Williams, and whether Quick had followed through. On Margaret, and where she might be, at that very moment. Then he turned to the local section, and his world stopped. The headline was small, buried on page 7. The kind of story that most people would skim past without a second thought. Mother and child found dead in Harlem apartment. Heroin overdose suspected. Bumpy's hands froze. He read it again, slower this time. Authorities discovered the bodies of a young woman and infant Thursday evening in a residence on 147th Street. Neighbors reported not seeing the woman for several days. Police believe the cause of death was a heroin overdose. Names are being withheld pending notification of family. 147th Street. Young woman, infant, heroin. The description fit. It fit too well. Bumpy's chest tightened. His breathing became shallow. The sounds of the restaurant, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation faded into a distant buzz. He read the article a third time, searching for details that would prove it wasn't Elise, wasn't Margaret. But there were none. Just cold, clinical words describing a tragedy that happened every week in Harlem. Another mother lost to the needle. Another child who never had a chance. The newspaper trembled in his hands. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. Heads turned. People stared. Bumpy didn't care. He stumbled toward the door, the newspaper still clutched in his fist. Quick saw him coming and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. "Boss, find her," Bumpy said, his voice cracking. "Find Elise. Now. Right now." "What happened?" Bumpy shoved the newspaper at him, jabbing his finger at the article. "Quick, read it." His face went pale. "Get every man we have," Bumpy said. "Search every apartment, every shooting gallery, every place she might be. I don't care what it takes. Find my daughter. Find my granddaughter." His voice broke on the last word. And then, right there on 7th Avenue, in front of Small's Paradise, in front of everyone, Bumpy Johnson fell to his knees. The sidewalk was hot beneath his knees. Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd walked into rooms full of armed enemies without flinching, who'd survived some of the most dangerous prisons in America, who'd built an empire on nerve and reputation, knelt on the concrete outside Small's Paradise and broke apart. The newspaper crumpled in his fist. His shoulders shook. Tears he'd been holding back since the night before finally came flooding out. People stopped walking. Conversations died mid-sentence. A woman gasped. A man took off his hat out of respect, though he wasn't sure respect was the right response. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. Legends don't cry in public. Kings don't fall apart on street corners. Men like Bumpy Johnson don't break where people can see. But he was breaking. Quick crouched beside him, one hand on his boss's shoulder, unsure what to do. He'd been trained to handle threats. Trained to drive fast, shoot straight, and keep his mouth shut. Nobody trained him for this. "Boss," Quick said quietly. "We're gonna find her. I promise you. We're gonna find her." Bumpy didn't respond. He just stared at the pavement, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "I failed her. I failed them both." The thought repeated like a drum beat. Relentless, unforgiving. He'd spent years trying to protect Harlem, trying to be the man people could count on when the system failed them. He'd paid rent for strangers, fed families he'd never met, made sure kids had a chance at something better. But his own daughter? His own granddaughter? He couldn't save them. What kind of protector was he if he couldn't protect his own blood? Quick stood and started barking orders to the men who'd gathered. Within minutes, the word spread through Harlem like wildfire. Every soldier, every associate, every person who owed Bumpy Johnson a favor, they all got the same message. Find Elise Johnson. Find the baby. Now. Cars scattered in every direction. Men knocked on doors, asked questions, searched buildings. They hit the shooting galleries first, the abandoned apartments, where addicts gathered to use, the places where hope went to die. Nothing. They checked the flop houses, the shelters, the back rooms of bars where dealers operated. Nothing. An hour passed. Then 2. Bumpy stayed on that sidewalk, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. Mamie arrived. Someone had called her and she knelt beside him, holding him while he shook. "We don't know it's her," she whispered. "We don't know for sure, but they both knew it could be." In a neighborhood drowning in heroin, where young mothers overdosed every week, where babies died in cribs because no one was sober enough to feed them, it could absolutely be Elise. It could absolutely be Margaret. The not knowing was agony. Worse than any beating Bumpy had ever taken. Worse than any prison sentence. Worse than any betrayal, because this wasn't something he could fight. Wasn't something he could negotiate, or intimidate, or buy his way out of. This was just loss. Raw. Inevitable. Final. 2.5 hours after Bumpy collapsed, a car pulled up fast. One of his men, a young guy named Marcus, jumped out, breathless. "We found someone," Marcus said quickly. "A woman matching Elise's description. She's alive. 147th Street. Bumpy's head snapped up. "The baby?" Marcus hesitated. "We don't know yet, but she's there. The apartment. We didn't go in, we waited for you." Bumpy was on his feet before Marcus finished talking. Quick already had the Cadillac running. They tore through Harlem streets, weaving between cars, running red lights, not caring who saw or what laws they broke. Bumpy sat in the back seat, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. Please, please let her be alive, please. He wasn't even sure who he was praying to anymore. God, the universe, fate, anyone who might be listening. The Cadillac screeched to a stop outside a decaying tenement on 147th Street, the kind of building landlords abandoned and the city forgot. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, the smell of garbage and despair. Bumpy didn't wait for Quick to open the door. He was out and running before the car fully stopped. Up the stairs, 2 at a time, 3rd floor, door hanging half off its hinges. His men stood outside, waiting. In there, one of them said, pointing. Bumpy pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. Rot, filth, the sour stench of unwashed bodies and old food. The apartment was barely livable, no furniture except a stained mattress on the floor, trash piled in corners, needles scattered like confetti. And there, on the mattress, was Elise. Thin, pale, barely conscious, but alive. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard footsteps. Recognition flickered across her face, followed immediately by shame. "Daddy," she whispered. But Bumpy wasn't looking at her. His eyes scanned the room frantically, searching. "Where's the baby?" he demanded. "Elise? Where's Margaret?" Elise's hand lifted weakly, pointing toward the corner. Bumpy turned, and there, in a cardboard box lined with dirty blankets, was his granddaughter. Margaret, barely moving, eyes half closed, her tiny body so thin he could see her ribs, her skin pale and dry. Bumpy crossed the room in 3 steps, dropped to his knees, and lifted her out of the box. She was so light, too light. He held her against his chest and felt her shallow breathing, and for the second time that day, Bumpy Johnson wept. Real quick, if this story is hitting you, tap that like button. It helps more people discover these untold stories, and trust me, you need to hear how this ends. The 3 hours before finding Elise had been hell on earth, but to understand just how desperate that search was, how close everything came to ending in tragedy, you need to see what was happening in the streets while Bumpy knelt on that sidewalk. Harlem in 1952 was in the middle of a crisis most people didn't want to talk about: heroin. It had arrived quietly at first, slipping into the neighborhood through the same channels that brought jazz, fashion, and culture. But by the early 50s, it had become an epidemic. Young men coming back from the Korean War, already traumatized, found temporary relief in the needle. Young women, trapped in poverty with no way out, turned to it as an escape. The drug didn't discriminate. It took musicians, factory workers, mothers, fathers. It hollowed out families and left children orphaned in apartments that smelled like death. And the authorities? They didn't care, as long as the problem stayed in Harlem. As long as it didn't spill into white neighborhoods, the police looked the other way. Overdoses were filed as statistics. Dead addicts were buried in unmarked graves. Children left behind became someone else's problem. This was the world Bumpy's men were searching through. Marcus hit the first shooting gallery on 145th Street, a basement apartment where 15 people lay scattered across the floor in various states of consciousness. The air was thick with smoke and the sweet, sickly smell of burning heroin. He checked every face, asked questions nobody wanted to answer. No Elise. No baby. 2 blocks over, another crew searched a flophouse where addicts paid 50 cents a night for a mattress on the floor. Women with hollow eyes and track-marked arms stared at them with suspicion. One of them recognized Elise's description. "Yeah, I seen her. Week ago, maybe. Had a baby with her, crying all the time. Haven't seen her since." A lead, but not enough. They kept moving, quick, coordinated from the Cadillac, parked near Small's Paradise, using a payphone to relay information. Every 10 minutes, someone called in with an update. Every 10 minutes, the news was the same. Nothing yet. Back on the sidewalk, Bumpy remained on his knees. Mamie stayed beside him, her hand on his back, whispering reassurances. She didn't fully believe herself. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Nobody approached. Nobody spoke. They just watched in stunned silence as one of Harlem's most powerful men unraveled in real time. An old woman from the neighborhood, Miss Claudette, who'd known Bumpy since he was young, walked up slowly, and placed a hand on his shoulder. God ain't done with your story yet, baby, she said softly. You hold on. You hear me? You hold on. Bumpy nodded, but he couldn't speak. The search continued. Men checked abandoned buildings, knocked on doors of known dealers, questioned street corner lookouts who saw everything and said nothing until Bumpy Johnson's name came up. Then they talked. Try 147th. Building near the corner? Heard somebody been squatting there. Another lead. Marcus and two others headed to 147th Street. The building looked condemned. Windows boarded up. Front door barely hanging on. The kind of place you walked past without looking twice. They went inside. The stairwell reeked of urine and mold. Broken glass crunched under their feet. Somewhere above, a baby cried thin, weak, barely audible. Marcus's heart jumped. Third floor. Door ajar. He pushed it open slowly, and there she was. Elise Johnson, unconscious on a filthy mattress. Needle still on the floor beside her, and in the corner a cardboard box. Marcus didn't go inside, didn't touch anything. He turned and ran back down the stairs, nearly tripping in his hurry. He found the nearest payphone and called quick. We got her. Those 3 words changed everything. Within minutes, Bumpy was in the Cadillac. Within 10 minutes, he was standing in that apartment doorway. And within seconds of seeing that cardboard box, he was holding his granddaughter for the first time. The search was over. But the real story, the one that would define the rest of Bumpy Johnson's life, was just beginning. What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny? Rainy? Let me know below. Time moved differently in that apartment. Seconds stretched into eternities. Every breath Bumpy took felt too loud. Every heartbeat thundered in his ears. He stood there, holding Margaret against his chest, feeling the faint rise and fall of her tiny ribcage. She was so small, so fragile, like she might disappear if he held her too tight or slip away if he didn't hold her tight enough. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was pale, almost gray. Her lips were dry and cracked. She didn't cry, didn't make a sound, just lay there in his arms, barely present, like she'd already started giving up on the world. Bumpy had seen death before. He knew what it looked like, and this baby, his granddaughter, was too close to it. Get a doctor, he said, his voice hoarse. Now, Quick was already moving, heading back down the stairs to make the call. Bumpy turned toward the mattress where Elise lay. She was awake now, barely, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She tried to sit up but couldn't manage it. Her body was too weak, too wrecked. Daddy, she whispered again, her voice cracking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Bumpy wanted to be angry, wanted to yell, wanted to demand answers. How could she let it get this bad? How could she bring a child into this nightmare and then abandon her to it? But when he looked at his daughter, really looked at her, he didn't see a villain. He saw a victim. Heroin hadn't just taken her body. It had taken her mind, her will, her ability to be the mother she probably wanted to be. Addiction didn't care about love, didn't care about responsibility. It just consumed everything until nothing was left. We're getting you help, Bumpy said quietly. Both of you. You hear me? This ends today. Elise's eyes filled with tears. She nodded weakly, then turned her face away, ashamed. Bumpy looked back down at Margaret. Her tiny fingers twitched slightly against his chest. A reflex, maybe. Or maybe some deep, primal part of her recognized that she was finally safe. He pressed his lips to her forehead. She was warm, but not feverish. That was something. That was hope. I got you now, baby girl, he whispered. I got you. Nobody's ever gonna hurt you again. You hear me? Nobody. It was a promise, a vow. The kind you make when you know your entire life has just changed direction. Mamie appeared in the doorway, breathless from climbing the stairs. She took one look at the apartment, the filth, the needles, the despair, and her hand flew to her mouth. Then she saw the baby in Bumpy's arms. Oh my God, she breathed. She crossed the room quickly, her eyes scanning Margaret's tiny frame. Mame had raised children. She knew what healthy babies looked like. And this wasn't it. We need to get her to a hospital, Mame said urgently. Right now, Bumpy. She's malnourished, dehydrated, Lord knows what else. Doctor's on the way, Bumpy said. But you're right, we're not waiting. He wrapped Margaret more securely in the dirty blanket she'd been lying on. It was all they had, and turned toward the door. What about her? Mamie asked, nodding toward Elise. Bumpy paused. looked back at his daughter one more time. "Marcus," he called out. One of his men stepped into the doorway. "Stay with her. Don't let her leave. Don't let her use. When the doctor gets here, make sure she gets checked too. Then we're getting her into a treatment program. I don't care what it costs." Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir." Bumpy carried Margaret down the stairs, moving carefully, cradling her like she was made of glass. May stayed close, one hand on his arm, steadying him. Outside, the Cadillac was waiting. "Quick, had the back door open." "Harlem Hospital," Bumpy said as he slid into the seat, still holding Margaret. "Fast." The car took off. Bumpy sat in the back, staring down at his granddaughter's face. She still hadn't opened her eyes, hadn't made a sound, but she was breathing. That was enough. For now, that was enough. Mamie reached over and gently touched Margaret's cheek. "She's a fighter," Mamie said softly. "Look at her. She survived this long in that place. She's got your blood in her, Bumpy. She's strong." Bumpy's throat tightened. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The drive to Harlem Hospital took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every second, Bumpy watched Margaret's chest, making sure it kept rising and falling. Every second, he prayed she'd hold on just a little longer. When they arrived, Bumpy didn't wait for Quick to park. He was out of the car and through the hospital doors before anyone could stop him. "I need a doctor," he shouted. Now, nurses came running. A doctor appeared within seconds. They took one look at the baby in Bumpy's arms and immediately went into action. "How long has she been like this?" the doctor asked, already examining Margaret as they rushed her toward a treatment room. "I don't know," Bumpy said, his voice breaking. "I just found her. Please help her." The doctor nodded. "We'll do everything we can." They took Margaret from his arms, and for the first time since he'd picked her up, Bumpy felt the full weight of what had almost happened. He'd been minutes away from losing her. Maybe seconds, if Marcus had searched one block over instead of 147th Street, if the tip had come 5 minutes later, if Elise had overdosed just a little bit harder, Margaret would have died in that cardboard box. Alone, forgotten. Another statistic in a city that didn't care. But she didn't, because Bumpy Johnson, the most feared man in Harlem, had fallen to his knees and refused to give up. Margaret Johnson spent 4 days in Harlem Hospital. 4 days of IV fluids, round-the-clock monitoring, and doctors working to undo weeks of neglect. She was severely malnourished, dehydrated, underweight for her age, but she was alive. And with every passing hour, she got a little bit stronger. Bumpy didn't leave the hospital. He slept in a chair beside her crib, refused to go home, refused to handle business. His men brought him food he barely touched, and updates on the streets he barely heard. Nothing mattered except that tiny girl fighting for her life behind the glass. May came every day, bringing fresh clothes, homemade meals, and the kind of steady presence Bumpy desperately needed. She'd sit with him in silence, or talk about nothing in particular, or pray quietly while he stared at Margaret through exhausted eyes. On the 3rd day, Margaret opened her eyes fully, for the first time. The nurse noticed first and called Bumpy over. He stood at the crib, looking down at his granddaughter, and watched as her dark eyes focused on his face. She didn't cry, didn't smile, just looked at him with an expression that seemed far too old for a baby, like she was trying to figure out if this man was safe, if this place was safe, if anything in the world could be trusted. Bumpy reached down and gently touched her hand, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb instinctively, and he broke down again. Not the violent, desperate tears from the sidewalk. These were different, quieter. The kind that come from relief so overwhelming it has nowhere else to go. "I got you," he whispered. "I promise, baby girl. I got you." On the 5th day, the doctors cleared Margaret to go home. Home wasn't the apartment on 147th Street. It wasn't anywhere near the life she'd been born into. Home was Bumpy and May's house in a quiet part of Harlem, a brownstone with clean floors, warm beds, and a nursery that May had spent 3 days preparing. She'd bought clothes, bottles, diapers, toys, everything a baby needed, everything Margaret had never had. When they brought her through the front door, May cried. "Welcome home, sweet girl," she said, kissing Margaret's forehead. "Welcome home." Bumpy stood in the doorway, watching his wife cradle his granddaughter, and felt something shift inside him, something fundamental, permanent. He'd spent his entire adult life building power, protecting territory, making sure people feared and respected his name. But none of that mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the little girl sleeping peacefully in Maymay's arms. Elise was a different story. After Margaret was taken to the hospital, Bumpy had kept his word. He got Elise into a treatment program, one of the few in New York, that would take black patients. It wasn't easy, it wasn't cheap, and it wasn't guaranteed to work. Addiction didn't have a cure. It had battles. Some you won, some you lost. Elise fought hard. There were good days and bad days. Days when she seemed like herself again, the daughter Bumpy remembered before the drugs took her, and days when the cravings were so strong she could barely speak, but she kept fighting, and Bumpy kept showing up, visiting, talking, reminding her that she wasn't alone, that Margaret was safe, that there was still a future worth living for. It would take years, relapses, heartbreak, but Elise would eventually find her way back. Not perfect, not without scars, but alive, present, trying. And that was more than Bumpy had dared hope for on that sidewalk outside Small's Paradise. As for Kesha Williams, the little girl who'd tapped on the Cadillac window and changed everything, Bumpy kept his promise to her, too. Quick had tracked down her apartment the same day, paid 2 years' rent up front, set up weekly food deliveries through a local church, got her mother, Mrs. Williams, a job at a Harlem bakery, owned by one of Bumpy's associates. A week after Margaret came home, Bumpy went to visit them himself. Mrs. Williams opened the door, and her eyes went wide with recognition and gratitude. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice trembling. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," Bumpy said. "Just take care of that little girl. That's all I ask." Kesha appeared behind her mother, peeking around her legs shyly. When she saw Bumpy, her face lit up. "You came back," she said. Bumpy crouched down to her level. "I told you I'd help, didn't I?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Well, I keep my promises," he said. "You make sure you grow up strong, okay? Study hard, be good to your mama, and if you ever need anything at all, you come find me." Kesha threw her arms around his neck and hugged him tight. And Bumpy, who'd been hugged by presidents and crime bosses, who'd shaken hands with some of the most powerful people in America, felt like that hug meant more than all of it combined. Because it wasn't about power. It was about being the kind of man a hungry child could trust. The kind of man who didn't just take from the world but gave something back. Stories like this remind us that people are never just one thing. If you want more deep dives into the complicated truth behind legendary figures, hit subscribe. New stories every week. So what do we do with a story like this? How do we make sense of a man like Bumpy Johnson, a criminal who fed the hungry, a gangster who saved children, a kingpin who wept on sidewalks? The easy answer is to pick a side. Call him a hero or a villain. Put him in a box that makes sense to our modern sensibilities. But the truth is never that simple. Bumpy Johnson ran an illegal gambling operation that generated millions of dollars. He was involved in violence. He broke laws. He operated outside a system that was supposed to protect people. But that same system had failed Harlem completely. In 1952, black families couldn't get bank loans, couldn't buy homes in certain neighborhoods, couldn't access the same opportunities as white Americans. The police didn't protect Harlem, they occupied it. Politicians didn't serve the community, they ignored it. So people like Bumpy Johnson filled the gap. He became the bank when banks wouldn't lend. He became the protector when police wouldn't protect. He became the employer when legitimate businesses wouldn't hire. Was it legal? No. Was it necessary? To the people of Harlem? Absolutely. And that's the contradiction we have to sit with. Bumpy Johnson was both things at once. Criminal and community leader. Feared and loved. Dangerous and dependable. The moment with Kesha Williams didn't erase his crimes, but his crimes didn't erase his humanity either. What that moment on Lenox Avenue revealed was something deeper, that even men who operate in darkness can be moved by the light. That even the hardest hearts can break when confronted with a child's suffering. And sometimes, that breaking is what saves us. Margaret Johnson, the baby Bumpy pulled from that cardboard box, grew up in his home. Mamie raised her as her own. She was fed, clothed, educated, and loved. She didn't grow up in shooting galleries or tenements. She grew up with opportunity, because one man refused to let her die forgotten. Elise struggled with addiction for years, but she survived. She got clean. She relapsed. She got clean again. It wasn't a fairy tale recovery. It was messy, painful, and real. But she lived. And eventually, she rebuilt a relationship with her daughter. Because one man didn't give up on her, Kesha Williams and her mother stayed in their apartment. Mrs. Williams kept her job at the bakery. Kesha went to school. She grew up healthy, safe, and fed. Because one man saw her suffering and decided it mattered. These aren't small things. In a world that constantly told black families in Harlem that they didn't matter, that their pain was invisible, their struggles irrelevant, Bumpy Johnson made them matter. Not perfectly, not legally, but undeniably. And maybe that's the real lesson here. We live in a world that loves simple stories, good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains, black and white. But real life exists in the gray spaces. Real life is a gangster crying over a hungry child, a criminal keeping his promises, a feared man brought to his knees by love. Real life is complicated, contradictory, human. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, 16 years after the day Kesha Williams tapped on his window. He never stopped being a criminal, never stopped running his operations, never became a saint, but he also never stopped helping people. And when he died, thousands of people lined the streets of Harlem to pay their respects. Not because he was perfect, but because he was theirs. Because in a world that had abandoned them, he showed up. So the next time you hear about someone and think you've got them figured out, that you know exactly who they are based on a headline or a reputation, remember this story. Remember that the most feared man in Harlem once cried over a little girl's hunger. Remember that the same hands that built a criminal empire also lifted a dying baby out of a cardboard box. Remember that people are never just one thing. We're all walking contradictions, all capable of darkness and light, all trying to make sense of a world that doesn't always make sense. And sometimes, just sometimes, the worst of us can do the best things. Not because we're heroes, but because we're human. If this story moved you, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, because history isn't just about dates and names. It's about moments like this. Real, raw, human. I'll see you in the next one. Before you go, drop a comment and tell me what surprised you most about this story.